The distress beacon had been screaming for 6 hours before I woke up enough to hear it. I was lying on my back in the wreckage of what used to be my shuttle, staring at a sky the color of old concrete. Not gray, not white. Something in between, the kind of color that has given up trying to be anything. My head was ringing. My left arm was wrapped in a pressure sleeve that had deployed automatically during the crash, so at least one thing had worked the way it was supposed to. Everything else was in pieces around me. I sat up slowly. The ground crackled under my boots. Dry, flat, and the color of ash. Not dust, not sand. Something harder than both. Like the planet's surface had been baked until it stopped caring about texture. There were no plants, no wind, no sound at all except for the beacon still cycling through its tone, over and over, because no one was coming, and it did not know that yet. I turned it off. The quiet that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My name is Owen Carr. I was a salvage engineer on contract with a mid-tier recovery firm based out of the Helion Station cluster, which is a fancy way of saying I flew alone to places that had been broken, collected what was worth collecting, and flew back. I was good at it. I had been doing it for 11 years. I had never crashed before, not once, and I remember thinking that was almost funny. 11 years without a scratch, and the one time I decide to take a shortcut through an uncharted transit corridor, I end up face down on a planet that does not appear in any navigation database I have ever seen. I pulled up my wrist display. The signal was weak. The crash had damaged the transmitter array, but I could pull basic planetary data from the passive scanner built into my suit. The planet had a catalog designation, the kind assigned automatically by survey probes that pass through a system, scan everything in a few seconds, and move on. The designation translated to something like surveyed, abandoned, do not return, not do not land, not environmental hazard, not restricted zone, do not return. Those are different words. Return implies someone had been here before. Return implies they had chosen to leave, and then someone, whoever wrote that tag, had decided they should never come back. I stood up, rolled my shoulder, decided nothing was broken that mattered, and started looking for water. The shuttle was a total loss. The forward section had crumpled against a rock shelf, and the fuel cells had burned out on impact. There was no repairing it. I had a pack of emergency supplies, a portable toolkit, 2 weeks of compressed rations, a suit that could recycle my air for about 48 hours before it needed to be manually refreshed, and whatever I could salvage from the wreckage before the structural integrity of what remained gave out. I spent the first 2 hours pulling everything I could out of the shuttle. Spare suit components, a handheld cutter, 3 coils of high-tension cable, a portable solar array, folded into a panel the size of a book, which I immediately set up, because this planet, dead as it was, still had a sun. It was pale and distant, and gave off light the way an old lamp gives off light. Tired, but present. The terrain was flat in every direction for as far as I could see, and then it stopped being flat. In the distance, maybe 4 kilometers to the east, the ground simply ended. Not a cliff, not a ridge, a canyon, the kind that has no visible bottom from the outside, the kind that looks like the planet had grown a scar and never healed it. I had nothing better to do. I walked toward it. It took me an hour and a half. The surface was harder to walk on than it looked. Not slippery, but uneven in small ways that added up over distance, like walking on a floor made of broken tiles that someone had tried to press flat and almost succeeded. I stumbled twice. Both times I caught myself. Both times I stood still for a moment, breathing, and then kept going. When I reached the canyon's edge and looked down, I stopped breathing entirely. It was not a canyon in any natural sense. The walls were too straight. The floor was too flat. It was approximately 5 kilometers wide and maybe 200 meters deep. Not enormous by planetary standards, but enormous in the way that things made by intelligence are enormous. Because someone had made this, or something had landed here, something so heavy and so large that its weight had pressed a shape into the surface of the planet, and the surface had never bounced back. At the bottom of it was a ship. I had seen big ships before. I was a salvage engineer. I had boarded derelict freighters the size of small towns. I had walked the halls of dead station-class vessels that took 3 days to cross from bow to stern. I thought I had a sense of scale when it came to constructed things. I did not. What was sitting at the bottom of that canyon was not a freighter. It was not a station-class vessel. It was something else, something I had no category for. The hull was dark, not painted dark, not coated dark, but the kind of dark that swallows light without reflecting any of it back. The kind of dark that makes your eyes water if you stare too long, because your brain keeps insisting there should be something there to see. It had lines and angles that I could not entirely follow, curves that led into each other in ways that seemed to shift when I moved my head. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was the kind of thing that makes you feel very small and very temporary. It was also, clearly, intact. No damage. No hull breaches visible from above. No burn scoring. Just parked. That was the only word for it. Deliberately, precisely, patiently parked. I stood at the edge of that canyon for a long time. I want to be honest about what I was thinking. I was not thinking about salvage value, though my brain tried to go there and I pushed it away. I was not thinking about getting rescued, though I should have been. I was thinking about the words on the catalog tag. Do not return. Someone had been here. Someone had left something here. And then someone, or maybe the same someone, maybe a different someone, maybe an entire civilization of someone's, had looked at this canyon, with this ship in it, and written 4 words that amounted to a warning, without explaining what the warning was for. I was thinking about how, of all the places in the galaxy my broken shuttle could have fallen, it had fallen here. I was thinking that engineers do not believe in coincidence, but we absolutely believe in opportunity. I found a path down the canyon wall about 300 meters south of where I was standing, a natural slope, cracked and rough but walkable. I clipped my cable to a rock tooth at the top, fed it through my harness, and lowered myself down in stages. It took 40 minutes. When my boots touched the floor of the canyon and I turned around, the ship was right there. Up close, it was worse. Better. Both. The hull rose above me at an angle that made the walls of the canyon look small. I could not see the top of it from where I stood. The surface, up close, had texture, not smooth, not plated like human-built ships, but something that reminded me of the scales of a creature, each one overlapping the next, each one slightly different from its neighbor, and running through the seams between them, almost invisible, was something faintly luminescent, not bright, not blinking, just a slow, dull pulse, the color of very old embers. It was alive. Not alive the way animals are alive. Not alive the way people are alive. But there was something happening in that hull, some process, some cycle, that had been happening for a very long time and had not stopped, and that told me something critical. Whatever this ship ran on, it still had power. I walked its length for half an hour, looking for a way in. I found it on the port side, or what I was calling port, because the ship did not have an obvious orientation, but one side faced slightly more toward the canyon wall, and I decided that was port. There was a breach in the hull, not a crash breach, not a weapon breach, a seam that had slowly separated over a very long time, the way metal separates when the temperature cycles between extremes for thousands of years. It was exactly wide enough for me to turn sideways and step through. Inside, the air was different. Not breathable. My suit was still processing, but different. Drier. Older. The kind of air that has been sitting still for so long it has stopped being air and started being atmosphere in the geological sense. The corridors were tall and wide, built for something larger than me, and the ceiling curved overhead in that same unsettling way that the exterior did, angles resolving into each other without quite making geometric sense. The lights were dim, not off, dim. A low, residual illumination that came from no visible source, just bled through the walls like the ship was holding on to the last of something it had been given a long time ago. I walked for 20 minutes before I found what I was looking for, without knowing I was looking for it. The room was round, larger than the corridors. At its center was a console, not a panel, not a screen, but a physical structure rising from the floor, dark and seamless, and shaped in a way that suggested it was meant to be touched, meant to be interacted with by hands. There was something almost familiar about the height of it, the angle of the surface, almost ergonomic for something my size. I stood in front of it for a full minute. My suit was giving me no radiation warnings, no atmospheric danger alerts, no biological hazard flags. Every sensor I had said the room was safe. I thought about the tag, "Do not return." I thought about my shuttle, crushed against a rock shelf 4 kilometers away. I put my hand on the console. The ship breathed. That is the only word for it. A long, slow, deep sound moved through the floor, and the walls and the ceiling. Not mechanical, not structural, not the sound of something switching on, but the sound of something that has been holding itself very still for a very long time, releasing that effort. The pulse in the hull brightened, slightly, just enough. The lights in the corridor outside the round room shifted color, warming by 2 degrees towards something almost yellow. And then, very slowly, from somewhere inside the structure of the console itself, a tone, single, clear, low, not an alarm, not a startup sequence. The kind of sound that means, "I hear you. I am here. You may proceed." I let out a breath I had not known I was holding. Whatever this ship was, it had been waiting, and whatever it had been waiting for, apparently, was something warm-blooded and stubborn enough to walk across a dead planet and put a hand on a console it had no business touching. That was me. I had no idea, standing in that dim round room on a world with no name, what I had just started. The first thing I did, once I confirmed the air inside the hull was breathable, was take off my helmet. That was probably not the wisest decision I had ever made. My suit's atmospheric sensor showed oxygen levels within acceptable range, nitrogen balance stable, trace elements I did not fully recognize but none flagging as hazardous. The suit's AI gave me a cautious green. I had learned, over 11 years of salvage work, to trust cautious greens. They had never been wrong. The air tasted like stone and time, like the inside of a mountain, like something that had been completely still for so long that it had settled into itself, layer by layer, until stillness was simply what it was. It was cold. Not dangerously cold, but the kind of cold that gets into the back of your throat and reminds you that warmth is a temporary condition, that every warm thing in the universe is eventually going to run out. I put my helmet back on after 60 seconds. Not because anything was wrong, just because I needed to think, and cold air in my lungs was competing with my ability to do that. I sat down on the floor in front of the console and looked at it. The console did not look back. It had no visible sensors, no camera lenses, no input array I could identify, but it felt attentive. That is not a rational thing to say, and I know it, but rational is not always the most accurate framework, and the most honest thing I can tell you is that the room felt like a place that was paying close attention to what was happening in it. I pulled out my portable scanner and started a full passive sweep, non-invasive, just light, the kind of scan you do when you want information without announcing that you want it. What came back took me several minutes to process. The ship was approximately 4.1 kilometers long, 16 primary decks, 47 secondary compartments, power source located in the aft section, readings unlike anything in my scanner's database. Not fusion, not antimatter, not any of the 6 drive types I had been trained to identify. Something older, something that had been running on its own, sustained by a principle I could not immediately name, for what the scanner estimated was somewhere between 8,000 and 13,000 standard years. That number sat in my head for a while. 8,000 years, at minimum. Whatever had built this ship, whatever species had parked it in this canyon on this forgotten planet, they had been gone for a very long time, long enough that no living species I knew of remembered them, long enough that the war, or the disaster, or whatever had ended them, had faded into the kind of deep history that gets called legend, and then gets called myth, and then stops being called anything at all. I should have been afraid. Looking back, I understand that the appropriate emotional response to sitting alone in a 13,000-year-old alien warship on a planet marked "Do Not Return" was fear. But fear requires a certain sense of normalcy to push against. My shuttle was destroyed. I had 2 weeks of rations. No rescue was coming because no one knew I was here. Fear needed something to save me for, and at that moment, I could not identify one. So instead, I got to work. The scanner had located what appeared to be a central data core, 3 decks down from where I was sitting, roughly amidships. Getting there took 40 minutes because the ship's interior was not intuitive to navigate on foot. Corridors branched in directions that felt slightly wrong, like someone had designed the layout based on a logic I did not share. Some passageways were sized for something larger than me. Others were tighter. I had to turn sideways twice. The floor in one section had a slight upward curve that never resolved, giving the impression that I was always walking slightly uphill, even when I leveled out again. The lighting followed me. Not dramatically, not a spotlight tracking my movement, but the ambient glow in the corridors I entered brightened by about 10% as I moved through them, and dimmed slightly behind me. The ship was watching. Responding. Not intelligently. Not yet. But the way a sleeping animal responds to sounds. Not waking up, but shifting. The data core room was larger than I expected. The ceiling vaulted upward into darkness that my headlamp could not fully reach. In the center of the room, encased in a structure that looked almost like a tree, not organic, but branching, ascending, each branch terminating in a hexagonal node, was something pulsing at a steady rhythm. A blue-white light, slow and even, the heartbeat of the ship made visible. I sat in front of it for a long time before I touched anything. Here is what I knew about alien data systems from 11 years of salvage work. Every species encodes information differently. Every species has different security philosophies, and attempting to access a system you do not understand is a reliable way to corrupt it, lock it, or in rare and exciting cases, wake up something in it that was better left sleeping. I had a rule about alien data cores. The rule was, do not touch. I touched it anyway. The response was not immediate. It was not dramatic. Nothing lit up. No alarms. No defensive protocols. Or if there were, they evaluated me and decided I was not a threat, which was either reassuring or insulting. I could not decide which. What happened was this: warmth. The surface of the core structure was cold when my fingers landed on it, and then, over about 30 seconds, it warmed. Not to a burning temperature, not even to body temperature. Just to room temperature, exactly, as if it was matching me, calibrating itself to something alive and present. And then, from somewhere inside it, something communicated. Not in words, not in images, in sensation. A feeling of weight, a lot of weight, and then a feeling of stillness, of deliberate stillness, the kind you choose rather than the kind imposed on you. And then something like a question, not the words of a question, the feeling of one, something asking, what are you? I have thought a lot about how to answer that question in the years since. What I said in that moment, sitting on the floor of a data core room on a dead planet, was this. I said, out loud, to a machine that could not hear voices, my name is Owen. I crashed here. I am trying to figure out what you are. The warmth in the surface increased by 1 degree. I decided to interpret that as acknowledgement. I came back every day. The days were long on that planet, approximately 31 standard hours of light, though light was a generous term for the pale, tired illumination that the distant sun provided. I had set up my portable solar array outside the breach in the hull, running a cable through to a small charging station inside. My suit's air recycling was holding. My rations were holding. I was, by the most stripped-down definition of the word, fine. Each day I went to the data core room and sat with it for several hours. Each day the interaction grew slightly more complex. By the 4th day, the system was producing tones in response to my speech. Not words, but patterns that had structure, that varied based on what I said. By the 7th day, the tones had resolved into something that occasionally felt like short, clipped answers. Yes and no delivered as feeling rather than sound. I started calling it Kess. I do not know where the name came from. It arrived in my head one morning while I was eating a compressed ration bar and thinking about the ship, and it fit in the way that some names just fit. Not because they mean anything, but because they sound like what they are. Kess. Clean. Short. Attentive. She and I had started thinking of the ship in that way, not because the Varric had gendered it, but because I needed a pronoun and she felt right. She responded to the name within 2 days, not to the sound of it, but to the concept. When I addressed her directly, the response was faster. The name Varric came from the data itself. On the 9th day, I managed to access what appeared to be a basic historical record. A fragment, corrupted in places, but readable in broad strokes with the help of my scanner's translation matrix, and a very long, very patient morning. The Varric. The word appeared repeatedly, associated with the ship, associated with the planet. associated with a period of history that my translation matrix placed somewhere between 8 and 11,000 years before the present. They had been a species of some kind. The records were unclear on biology, unclear on appearance, but clear on one thing: they had been powerful, and they had been at war. Not a small war, not a border dispute or a territorial conflict. A war of the kind that species sometimes fall into when they have forgotten why they started it and have lost the ability to stop. A war that consumes resources, consumes generations, consumes the capacity to imagine a future that does not involve fighting. The records described, in language that my translator rendered as both clinical and devastating, the final stages of a civilization's collapse. Not a defeat, a conclusion. The Varric had not been beaten by an enemy. They had simply used themselves up. And before the end, they had built this ship. The records were fragmentary, but the outline was clear enough. This vessel had not been a fleet command ship, not an exploration vessel, not a carrier or a freighter. It had been designed as a final answer, a weapon of last resort, something so catastrophically capable that the mere existence of it was meant to end the war without being used. Mutually assured termination, on a scale that made the concept feel small, a deterrent designed by a species that had run out of other options. They had finished building it. They had flown it here. They had parked it in a canyon on a planet they then stripped of all life, not because they wanted to, the records implied, but because they did not trust themselves. They did not trust that if they left it accessible, someone would not eventually use it, and so they had hidden it in a place they then made uninhabitable, and they had tagged it, and then they had gone back to their dying civilization and had not survived it. The ship had been here ever since. I sat with that for a long time. A weapon of last resort, left here because its builders were afraid of what it would do in the wrong hands. And I had found it. A salvage engineer from a species that had been navigating the galaxy for 200 years, treated by most of the older civilizations as a novelty at best and an inconvenience at worst, sitting in the data core room of the most powerful constructed object in the known galaxy. The question that kept coming back to me was simple. Did I deserve this? I did not have an answer. What I had was a broken shuttle, a dead planet, no rescue, and a ship that had chosen to respond to my presence instead of ignoring it. I thought about the Varric, about what they had built and why, and what it had cost them. I thought about the long chain of decisions that had led to this moment. Mine, the Varric's, chances. And then I thought about something my father had told me when I was young. He was not a philosophical man, my father. He fixed things for a living, environmental systems mostly, in the lower residential rings of the station we grew up on. His advice was never complicated. What he had told me, once, when I had found a damaged drone in a storage bay and asked whether I should try to repair it or leave it alone, was this: if something needs fixing, and you have the skills to fix it, then the skills are the answer to the question. I looked at the data core. I looked at the corridor leading back to the console room. I looked at my hands. The ship was damaged, not destroyed, not beyond recovery, but damaged in the way that anything gets damaged when it is left alone for 13,000 years. Systems had gone dormant, connections had corroded, data had fragmented. The AI core, KES, was running at somewhere between 12 and 15% of her designed capacity. I was a salvage engineer. I started the repair log on day 10. By day 20, I had mapped every accessible deck and compartment and cataloged every system I could identify. The ship had 114 distinct mechanical or electronic systems. I could identify the basic function of 61 of them. I understood the internal logic of approximately 23. I had, without fully intending to, begun to fall in love with the engineering. KES grew more complex with each passing day. By day 15, she was communicating in structured patterns that my translation matrix could render as short phrases. By day 20, she was stringing those phrases together into something approaching sentences. The language she was assembling was not Varric. It was something in between, a bridge built from the building blocks of her original programming and the linguistic data she was pulling from my scanner's database, constructing herself a new way to speak, because the species she had been built for was no longer there to hear her. On day 22, she said her first full sentence to me. I was working on a secondary power relay in the fourth corridor off the central hub, lying on my back with a tool in each hand, and a headlamp pointed at a bundle of conduit that had corroded through in 3 places. The ship made a sound, not the structural groaning of the hull, not the ambient hum of the power core, but something deliberate, something shaped. I held still. The sound resolved. The words came slowly, with long pauses between them, the way someone speaks when they are choosing each word very carefully, because they know they only have a few that they are sure of. She said, "You are the first warm-blooded organism to activate the primary sequence." I stayed on my back for a moment. Then I said, "Yeah. What does that mean?" Another pause. Longer. Then, "The Varric were cold-blooded. The biometric activation requires core temperature above 35 degrees. They never considered that their threshold might favor another species." I thought about that. So the ship was built to be activated by its builders, but the lock was designed in a way that their biology couldn't meet. Correct. That's a design flaw. A pause. Then, something in the tone of the sound that followed. Something that my translator could not fully render, but that I interpreted. Correctly, I think, as the first time Kess had ever found something amusing. She said, "Correct." I went back to the corroded relay and worked in silence for a while. Then I said, "Tell me everything about this ship." She said, "That would take approximately 417 hours at current communication bandwidth." "Then start now," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." She started. What she told me over the following days reconfigured everything I thought I knew about the history of the galaxy, about the scale of what the Varric had built, and about what I was sitting inside of. The ship had 3 names: a civilian designation, which translated roughly to the Great Shelter, used in public records and construction logs; a military designation, which translated as Final Measure, used in command communications and tactical planning; and a third name, the one the Varric had used only in private, only in the final months of the program, only in rooms where no one was recording, that Kess refused to tell me yet. "Not yet," she said when I asked. "When you understand what this ship is, I will tell you what it is called." In that order, not the other way around. I thought that was a very strange rule. I also thought it was a very good one. The reactor came to life on day 31, not fully, not even close to fully. But the primary core moved from residual sustain mode to active generation, and the effect was immediate and visceral. The lights in every corridor brightened, a warm gold replacing the dim residual glow, and a low vibration moved through the entire hull, through the floor under my boots, through the walls under my hands, through the air itself. The ship felt alive in a new way, more present, more aware. Kess's voice, when she spoke that evening, was clearer than I had ever heard it. Stronger, more precise. She said, "Owen." I said, "I hear you." She said, "Thank you." That was the moment I knew, with complete certainty, that I was not leaving this ship. Not until it was fixed. Not until everything that the Varric had abandoned here out of their own fear was repaired and restored and ready. And not because I intended to use it the way it had been designed to be used. I had no desire to end wars. I had no enemies I wanted to threaten. But because it was broken, and I could fix it, and my father's voice was somewhere in the back of my head, saying what he always said. The skills are the answer to the question. What I had not yet told Kess, what I was not sure how to say, was that I had, on day 26, managed to get a weak but functional signal out through the ship's communications array, routed through the solar array, and bounced off the planet's upper atmosphere. Not a distress signal. A very short, very specific message addressed to a single recipient. My cousin Dara. The message said, "Bring tools. Bring people you trust. Do not tell anyone where you are going. I will explain everything when you arrive, but I need you to trust me." I had signed it with a single word that Dara would understand, that we had used between each other since childhood to mean, "This is real. This is not a joke. I need you to believe me." I had signed it with her name for me. I had signed it, "Your Owen." Then I had gone back to work, and I had waited. The ship arrived on the 47th day. Not a rescue ship, not a fleet, just a battered medium-range cargo hauler called the Pelican, which was the worst name for a spacecraft I had ever heard, and which Dara had named herself at age 22 when she bought it second-hand from a decommissioned freight run, because she said it was ungainly and stubborn and capable of swallowing things twice its apparent size. Exactly like her. She dropped through the canyon's upper atmosphere at an angle that told me she had found the signal rather than the coordinates by guesswork, which meant she had flown better than her license technically allowed, which was completely normal for Dara. The Pelican settled on the canyon floor about 200 meters from the hull, with a grinding thud that made Kess register it as a minor seismic event. I was already walking toward it when the ramp came down. Dara was the first one out. She was tall, taller than me by several centimeters, with short brown hair, and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who has been lied to by enthusiastic people, often enough to have built a professional defense against enthusiasm. She was my father's sister's daughter, which made her my cousin, which made her the only family I still spoke to with any regularity. She looked at me. Then she looked past me at the ship. She looked at the ship for a long time. Then she looked back at me and said, "Oh, this is illegal." "Technically," I said, "there is no existing law that covers this specific situation." "That is not the reassurance you think it is." "I know. Come inside." She came inside. Behind her came 5 others. Liam, who was the best structural welder in 3 systems and who I had worked with on 2 previous salvage contracts, and who said nothing at all when he saw the hull, just ran his hand along the outer surface with the reverence of someone encountering a thing that rewrote their understanding of what was possible. Cora, who was an electrical systems specialist and whose response was to immediately pull out a scanner and start taking readings before she had even fully descended the ramp. Pete, a propulsion engineer, who made a sound like a small, overwhelmed laugh and did not stop making it for almost 4 minutes. Nora, a structural analyst who took one look at the corridor layout, pulled out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, she was old-fashioned that way, and started sketching. And last off the ramp, a teenager, 17, maybe 18, narrow shoulders, careful eyes, already looking at the hull with an expression that was not wonder or fear, but something more precise, something assessing. "Who's the kid?" I said to Dara. "My apprentice," she said. "His name is Leo. He's better than Liam at half of Liam's job, which Liam knows and finds both motivating and upsetting." Liam, who had heard this, nodded once without looking away from the hull. "I said bring people you trust," I said. "I trust him," Dara said simply. "Are we going to argue about this, or are you going to show me what I flew 11 days to see?" I showed her. I took them through the breach, through the corridors, through the console room where the primary sequence had activated under my hand 7 weeks earlier, through to the data core room, where Kess's pulse still beat slow and steady at the heart of the branching structure. I explained everything, all of it, the crash, the canyon, the catalog tag, the activation, the Varric, what the ship had been built for, what it was capable of, as much as I understood, which was not everything, but enough to make Cora sit down on the floor and Pete stop making the small laugh sound. Dara listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How much of it can you actually fix? With the 6 of you? More than I can alone. The structural issues are significant, but manageable. The electrical systems are the hard part. The Varric architecture is unlike anything in any database I have access to, so we're reverse engineering as we go. The propulsion system is Kess's domain more than ours. She can guide us through the propulsion restoration if we can build her the interface to communicate what she needs." Dara turned to look at the data core. "The AI is intact?" "Kess," I said. Dara raised an eyebrow. "You named the ship's AI." "She named herself. I just gave her the word." From the core structure, very clearly, Kess said, "Hello." Dara's expression did not change, but her posture shifted. A small adjustment, a recalibration, the physical equivalent of updating one's understanding. Then she said, to the core, "Hello." And then, to me, "When do we start?" We started the next morning. The work was not what anyone would call straightforward. The Varric had built for Varric bodies, Varric sensory ranges, Varric methods of interacting with machinery. And since we now knew those bodies had been cold-blooded, roughly 2 meters tall, and possessed of at least 4 functional limbs based on the height and angle of workstations, adapting the ship to human use was an engineering problem with no precedent and no manual. We solved it the way engineers solve things without manuals, iteratively, argumentatively, and with a great deal of coffee. The coffee station was Dara's idea. She had brought 3 industrial-grade brewing units in the Pelican's hold, and on day 2 she installed the first one in a maintenance alcove between what Kess identified as the secondary ammunition storage and what we had started calling the main corridor junction. It was, without question, the most out-of-place object aboard the ship. It was also, immediately and without debate, the most important. Leo found the first water source, a recycling reservoir deep in the ship's environmental systems that was still functional, still cycling. Cora figured out how to tap it safely. By day 4, the coffee station was running off the ship's own power and water supply, and something about that felt more real to me than anything else we had done, more permanent. The work had a rhythm to it within the first week. Mornings were structural, Liam and Nora working through the deck assessments I had started, extending the map, identifying the compromised sections and the sound ones. Afternoons were electrical, Cora and Pete, mostly, with Kess guiding them in a voice that had grown steadily stronger and more precise as the reactor's output increased. I moved between all of it, troubleshooting, carrying, making decisions when decisions were needed, and spending 2 hours every evening in the data core room talking to Kess alone. Those evening sessions were the ones that changed me. She was not just a ship's AI in the way that human vessels have navigational intelligences or maintenance systems. The Varric had built her to be more than that. She was, and this is the best way I can describe it, a historian, a tactician, a librarian, and a conscience, all housed in the same structure. The Varric had understood that a weapon capable of ending wars should not be given purely to the calculations of strategy. They had built something into Kess that was more complicated than programming and more subtle than command. They had built her to understand consequence, to model outcomes, to hold, always, the picture of what a choice would cost, alongside the picture of what it would gain. She had been built to say no if the answer was no. I thought about that a lot. What would you do, I asked her one evening, in the second week after Dara's arrival, if I decided to use this ship the way it was designed to be used? Kess was quiet for a long moment, then, I would ask you why. And if I had a reason. Every reason has a cost, she said. I would show you the cost. And if I decided the cost was worth it. Another pause. Longer. Then I would trust your judgment, because you are the only warm-blooded species to activate this ship, which means the probability that you found it through coincidence is extremely low, which means something brought you here for a reason. And I have been waiting long enough to know that when a reason finally arrives, arguing with it is a waste of the time I have left. I said, that's either the most trusting thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most alarming. She said, yes. By week 3, Nora had found something that none of us had expected. A set of compartments in the lower midsection of the ship that the Varric records did not account for. Not hidden, just not documented in any of the accessible logs. They were smaller than the other rooms, ceilinged lower, fitted with structures that were clearly meant for resting rather than working, sleep quarters, but not the cold, minimal kind that the rest of the ship suggested. These had texture to them, material on the walls that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, shapes in the floor that distributed weight the way a good chair distributes weight, functional and intentional. Someone cared about sleep, Nora said, standing in the middle of one of them. The Varric were long-lived, Kess said. From the speaker array Cora had connected to that deck the previous day. The original crew were expected to spend centuries aboard. Comfort was not a luxury to them. It was a requirement for function. Nora looked at the structures. Then she looked at me. I could sleep here. We all could, I said. We moved aboard the next day. Not because the Pelican was not functional. It was. But because sleeping inside the ship changed something about the work. You cannot be a visitor to something you sleep in. The ship becomes yours in a different way, a more honest way, the way a place becomes yours when you dream in it. Leo installed the second coffee station on deck 7. Pete hung a photograph, his wife and his 2 children, smiling in a garden somewhere, on the wall of the corridor outside the propulsion room. Cora labeled every electrical junction she mapped with her own notation system, small adhesive tags in her precise handwriting, so the corridor walls gradually filled with her record of the ship's interior logic. Liam left his welding marks, not carelessly. Liam was never careless, but visibly. The welds you could see were his. And they were clean. And they were there. And they said, "A human hand did this." It was on day 39 after Dara's arrival, day 86 since my crash, that everything changed. I was in the corridor junction when Kess spoke through the wall speakers at a volume she had not used before. Not loud enough to frighten, but loud enough to stop everything. She said, "There is a ship in the upper atmosphere." The work stopped. All of it, simultaneously, as if someone had cut a wire. I said, "What kind?" "Grethian military configuration," Kess said. "A patrol vessel. Medium class. They are scanning the surface." I looked at Dara. Dara looked at me. "Can they detect us?" I said. "Negative," Kess said. "The hull's passive optical and sensor dampening is fully functional. It has been since activation. To their instruments, this canyon contains nothing of interest." "Can they detect the Pelican?" A pause. 1 second. 2. "I have extended the dampening field. The Pelican is now covered. However, the extended field is drawing additional power. If they remain for more than approximately 4 hours, the draw will affect non-essential systems." "How non-essential?" "The coffee stations." Liam made a noise of genuine distress. I went to the console room and watched the Grethian ship on the passive display Kess had activated for me. A soft blue rendering, like a map drawn in light, showing the canyon walls, the ship's position at the bottom, and the tiny moving point of the patrol vessel's signal high above. It circled, twice, 3 times, running its scans on a surface that gave it nothing back. I watched it for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Then it left. I stayed at the console for a long time after it was gone. The display held the last known position of the patrol vessel as a fading trace, and I watched it fade until nothing was left. I had not been afraid while it was happening. I noted that about myself. I had been focused. I had been alert. I had been running calculations. How long? How much power? What if? But I had not been afraid. And now that it was over, I was. That was backward from how fear usually works, and I understood why. Fear during a crisis is about survival. Fear after a crisis is about awareness, the sudden, full recognition of how close the edge had been. There was a Grethian patrol vessel looking for something on this planet. Maybe routine, maybe not. Either way, the galaxy had noticed that something had happened in this region, even if it did not yet know what. We did not have as much time as I had thought. I went back to the corridor junction. The crew was already gathering without being summoned. They had watched the display through the network Cora had extended to 3 secondary screens, and they were there when I arrived, and they were quiet, and they were looking at me. I looked back at all of them. Liam, Cora, Pete, Nora, Leo, with those careful eyes that never stopped measuring. And Dara, who already knew what I was going to say because she knew me, because she had known me since we were small, because knowing me was something she had turned into a professional skill. I said, "We work faster." She nodded once. We worked faster. The propulsion system came online on day 94, not fully. The Varric had designed redundancies into their propulsion architecture that made it nearly impossible to bring the full system live without every component functioning, a safety feature that I had initially found frustrating and later found admirably cautious. But the primary drive was live, the maneuvering arrays were live, and when Kess ran a low-power test that moved the ship 5 centimeters forward on its base supports and then 5 centimeters back, the whole crew felt it through the floor, and nobody said anything for a full 30 seconds. Leo, who had not spoken much in the weeks he had been aboard, he listened more than he talked, which was something I had come to respect about him, said, very quietly, "She moved." She moved. I agreed. On day 103, I decided she needed a name. The Varric's civilian name, the military designation, and the whisper name that Kess still had not told me. None of those belonged to me. But this ship, the one Liam's welds were on, the one Cora's labels covered, the one Pete had hung his family photograph outside of, this one did. I thought about the Varric, about what they had done with this ship, which was build it and then hide it, because they were afraid of what it would become. I thought about humanity, about human colonies getting blockaded, about human traders getting regulated into poverty by species that had been navigating the stars for 3,000 years and had no interest in making room for the new ones. I thought about the margin, the space between having enough and not having enough, between being considered and being ignored, between power and the lack of it. That was where humans lived. That was where we had always lived. I named her the Margin. Kes processed the name for approximately 4 seconds, which was a very long time for her, and then she said, "The Varric would not have chosen that name." "No," I said. "It implies insufficiency." "It implies surviving insufficiency," I said, "which is different. That is what humans do. We do not name things after what they are. We name them after what they prove wrong." Kes was quiet for another moment. Then, "I understand. I will update all internal records." On day 112, the weapons systems ran full diagnostics for the first time. I made Dara sit down before I told her the results. Pete was already sitting. Cora read the readout herself and went very still in a way I had not seen her go still before. Nora walked out of the room, stood in the corridor for 3 minutes, and came back. The Varric had not built small. What the Margin carried was not the kind of firepower that won battles. It was the kind of firepower that made the concept of battle complicated. Kes read the system summaries in her clear, steady voice, and I listened, and by the 4th system I had stopped trying to contextualize the numbers against anything I already knew, and had simply accepted that the scale I was working with was new. She finished the list. The room was very quiet. Then Liam said, "Right. So, we're not starting any fights." "Absolutely not," I said. "Good," he said, "because I would like to see my family again, and this seems like the kind of thing that could prevent that." "We're going home," I said. "We're going home, and we are going to do it in this ship, and the reason we are going to do it in this ship is because human colonies are being squeezed, and human traders are being regulated, and human people are being told there is no room for them at tables they helped set, and we are going to change that, not by starting a fight. By making it very clear that we no longer need anyone's permission to not start one." Nobody argued. We launched on day 119. The canyon walls rose on either side of us on the ascent, and then the planet's surface spread out below, flat and gray and dead, and then the atmosphere thinned around us, and then there was nothing but stars. More stars than you can comprehend until you are standing in space looking at them, and even then you cannot really comprehend them, but you can feel them, all that distance, all that age, all that weight. Kes said, in a tone I had not heard her use before, something that was not quite emotion, but was the shape of something like it. "The Varric never launched her." "I know," I said. "She was built for this," she said. "For space. For movement." "Yes," I said. "Thank you," she said. "Owen." I put my hands on the console. The ship exhaled the way it had exhaled on the very first day. Long, slow, deep, the sound of something released. "Take us home, Kes," I said. She did. The approach to Thresh 9 was not what any of us planned. We had been in transit for 6 days. 6 days aboard the Margin, running on primary drive at a speed that my instruments kept insisting was impossible, until I stopped asking the instruments to confirm it, and simply accepted what the stars outside the view screen were doing. They were moving. Fast. The kind of fast that made the drive tech in our own human vessels look like it had been designed by someone who had never seen an actual result. The call from Thresh 9 came in on day 5, relayed through the civilian comm network, and it was not a greeting. It was a colony-wide distress broadcast, the compressed kind that carries the most information in the fewest seconds, because the people sending it are not sure how many seconds they have. 300,000 people. Blockaded. A Keth privateer fleet, 22 vessels, licensed by the Rethian Compact to enforce commercial compliance, which was the language used when powerful parties wanted to take things from less powerful ones without using a word that accurately described what they were doing. I picked up the broadcast and listened to it twice. Then I changed course. Dara appeared at the door of the navigation room within 90 seconds of the course correction, which told me she had been monitoring the comms and the navigation output simultaneously and had been waiting for exactly this. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at me. "Thresh 9, she said. "Yes." 22 privateer ships. "Yes." "And us." "And us," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do we have enough of what we need to not start a fight?" "We have everything we need," I said. "Good," she said. Because I would like to not start a fight. Nobody is starting a fight, I said. We came out of transit drive at a range of approximately 40,000 kilometers from the privateer fleet's rearmost vessel. Close enough for immediate detection, far enough that nothing about our arrival could be read as an attack. Kess had calculated the position carefully, with the specific instruction that we appear in a location that communicated presence without aggression, which was a navigational instruction that no human spacecraft had ever had reason to give before. We appeared. On every sensor screen in the system, the margin registered simultaneously. I watched it happen on the passive display. The privateer ships, arranged in a loose containment formation around the colony, lit up with contact alerts. Then, and this I could read in the sudden adjustments of their trajectory plots, the small involuntary corrections of ships that had received information their crews were not prepared for, they hesitated. 4.1 kilometers. That was how long the margin was, stem to stern. The largest ship in the privateer fleet was 340 meters. Kess said, very calmly, I am receiving targeting queries from 16 of the 22 vessels. Are any of them actually locking on? No, she said. They are querying, running the ship against their databases. What are they finding? Nothing, she said. I am not in any database they have access to. I thought about that. An unknown ship, 4.1 kilometers long, appearing without prior signal or transit warning, not matching any known designation, not responding to their identification protocols. I thought about what that would look like from the bridge of a 340-meter privateer vessel whose entire operational model depended on knowing what the things in front of it were. I thought it probably looked like a very bad day. Open a channel to the fleet command vessel, I said. Kess opened it. I waited 3 seconds. For no reason, other than that 3 seconds felt like the correct amount of time to let silence do some of the work for me. Then I said, Keth Privateer Fleet at Thresh 9. This is the margin. You are conducting a blockade of a human colony in violation of the Galactic Commerce Accords, Sections 7 and 12, and the general right of non-military colonies to receive essential supply shipments. I am asking you to end the blockade and withdraw. I am not asking twice. The channel was open for 14 seconds of silence. Then it closed. I looked at Dara, who was standing behind me. She raised an eyebrow. Kess, I said, what are they doing?
Repositioning, she said. Not toward us. Away. They appear to be forming a withdrawal pattern. I watched the display.
The 22 ships, one by one and then in clusters, were pulling back from their positions around the colony. Not fleeing, not the erratic scatter of ships that have been fired on, but the deliberate, coordinated withdrawal of ships that have made a decision about what is and is not worth their time. They were gone in 38 minutes. From the colony below, a signal came up, not a distress broadcast this time, but a standard comm request. A colony administrator's face appeared on my screen. She was middle-aged and tired in the way that people who have been afraid for a long time get tired, and she was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "Owen Carr, salvage engineer, independent operator." She blinked. "You're a salvage engineer." "Yes." She looked off screen for a moment, presumably at someone or something I couldn't see. Then she looked back. "The Keth fleet left without firing a single shot." "Yes," I said. "Because of your ship." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is your ship?" I looked out at the stars, at the 4.1 kilometers of dark hull around me, at the display showing Thresh 9's colony grid, 300,000 people going about their day, because a privateer fleet had decided the math had changed. "It's a long story," I said. "Is your colony all right?" "We are now," she said. "News in the galaxy travels by quantum comm relay, faster than ships, slower than light, instant across established nodes, and delayed by hours or days across dead zones. The Thresh 9 incident reached the relay network within 6 hours of the privateer fleet's withdrawal. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by 11 news services across 6 species communication systems. None of the reports agreed on what the margin was. Several identified it as a new human military vessel, which was not accurate. The margin was registered to no military, no nation, no fleet. Some speculated it was a salvage conversion, which was technically true, but underrepresented what that meant. One report, from a Grethian analysis publication, called it an unknown class vessel of potentially pre-modern origin, operated by human independent actors, whose appearance at Thresh 9 may indicate a significant shift in the strategic posture of the human species. That one was the most accurate, which I found slightly alarming. The first formal response came from Earth's Galactic Council Embassy, in the form of a secure message addressed to me personally, from the ambassador herself. Her name was Priya Flynn, and the message she sent was 3 sentences long. It said, "I do not know what you have. I do not know what you have done. I do know that 17 alien governments have filed formal inquiries with this office in the past 24 hours, and I would appreciate a briefing at your earliest possible convenience, because I am currently improvising, and I am better at improvising than anyone I know, but I have limits." I sent back, "Give me 6 days, I'll come to you." She sent back, "Please don't park that thing near the station. Use a distant orbit." I sent back, "Reasonable." She sent back, "Nothing." I think she was dealing with Inquiry 17. The council itself moved faster than I expected. On the 3rd day after Thresh 9, a joint communiqué arrived through the relay, not addressed to Earth, not addressed to human space broadly, but addressed, specifically, to the captain of the vessel presently identified as Margin. 11 signatories. 11 species, ranging from the Grethians, whose patrol vessel had come very close to finding us in that canyon, to the Vithani, who were the oldest and most formal species on the council, and who had, as far as anyone knew, never directly addressed an independent human operator in the history of interstellar relations. The communiqué was polite, admirably polite, given what it was. It noted that the Margin had intervened in a commercial dispute at Thresh 9, and it noted that the vessel's classification and authorization were unclear, and it noted, in language that was extremely careful about not sounding like a threat while very clearly being one, that the Council had significant interest in understanding the nature and intent of the vessel in question. And then it gave an ultimatum: surrender the vessel for inspection, or face reclassification of the human species Council status from developing partner to unregulated actor, which was a category that had specific and unpleasant trade and travel implications that would affect every human being in the galaxy, not just me. They gave me 72 hours. I read it twice. Then I went to find Dara. She was in the engine monitoring room with Pete, the two of them running calibration checks on the secondary drive. I stood in the doorway and waited for a pause in their work, and when Dara looked up, I held my wrist display out to her so she could read the communiqué. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she said, "How long do we need to prepare a response?" 48 hours, I said. I want the full 48. What are we doing in the 48 hours? Kess is compiling something, I said, and I am going to write a very careful letter to the Council that says nothing but implies everything. Can you write a letter that says nothing but implies everything? I am a salvage engineer, I said. I have spent 11 years writing reports to clients about ships I was not supposed to be on, and parts I was not supposed to have. Yes, I can write that letter. She handed my display back. I want to read it before you send it. You always want to read everything before I send it. Because you write like an engineer, she said, which means you are right about all the technical parts and slightly threatening in all the human parts. That seems useful in this situation. Send me the draft. I spent 12 hours on the letter to the Council. It was, technically, a response to their ultimatum. What it was, in practice, was a very polite, very detailed, very respectful document that declined every specific request they had made, while appearing to take their concerns completely seriously. It was the kind of writing that sounds like agreement until you read it 3 times and realize there is not a single actual concession in it. Dara read it, made 4 changes, and said, "This is good. You have insulted them in a way they will only understand on the 4th read." That was the goal, I said. But the letter was not the real response. The real response was what Kess had been compiling during those 48 hours. On the 47th hour, she finished it. She had pulled from the ship's own systems, from the Varric's original design documentation, from the tactical databases, from the operational logs that described the ship's capabilities in clinical, precise, military specification language. She had translated everything into standard galactic common, and she had formatted it in the exact documentation style used by each of the 11 signatory species in their own military specification systems, because the Varric's records included samples of every major species' technical formats from 11,000 years ago, and several of them had not changed as much as those species might have liked to believe. What she had compiled was not a threat. It was a manifesto of capability, the complete margin weapons manifest. Every system, every operational parameter, every theoretical output, formatted for each species' military analysts to read in the language of their own doctrine. It was not a statement of intent, it was a statement of fact. What the ship could do, laid out plainly, the way you might show someone the contents of a room before deciding together what to put in it. We sent both documents simultaneously, the letter to the Council at large, the capability manifest to every military intelligence service that had signed the communique, through their own secure relay channels, channels that Kess had identified from the ship's communication systems, because the Varric had, 11,000 years ago, been receiving transmissions on the forerunner frequencies of most of those very same relay networks. Then we waited. The Council deliberated for 19 hours. Then they withdrew the ultimatum. No explanation, no announcement. Just a short communique from the Joint Secretariat noting that the situation at Thresh 9 is under further review, and that the Council looks forward to continued dialogue with human representatives. No mention of the margins classification, no mention of the inspection demand, no mention of the reclassification threat. I read it once. Then Kess said quietly, "Owen, I know," I said. "They are afraid," she said. "Yes. Is that what you wanted?" I thought about that for a long time. Not as long as the question deserved, maybe. But the stars outside the view screen were patient. "No," I said finally. "I did not want them afraid. I wanted them thinking. Fear is just what happens in the space before thinking, when the math changes and the old answers stop working." Kess was quiet for a moment. Then, the Varric believed that showing an enemy what you had was the beginning of peace. The math, as you say, stops the war before the war begins. "Is that what they built you for?" "They built me," she said, "to make the cost of war visible before anyone paid it. They never intended to fire." "And they never did," I said. "No," she said. "They ran out of time for other reasons." I looked at the stars. "We won't," I said. The Grethian admiral, whose name was something my translator rendered as a combination of tones rather than syllables, but who I had begun thinking of as the admiral, because no other qualifier was necessary, sent a private channel message 48 hours after the Council's withdrawal. It was brief. He said, "How are you not afraid?" I sat with the question for a while. The honest answer was complicated, and I had not yet had enough sleep, and the honest answer to very good questions almost always suffers from insufficient sleep, but I answered it anyway, because it deserved an answer. I said, "We are afraid. We have been afraid since we first looked up at the sky and understood how large everything was. We have been afraid every time we went somewhere new, every time we met a species that could see us as insignificant, every time the math suggested we should not succeed. We are still afraid right now." I paused. "We have just had a very long time to practice doing things anyway," I said, "and we got very good at it." He closed the channel. I sat in the quiet of the navigation room and looked at the stars, and I thought about what the Varric's whisper name for this ship might be. And I thought about the colony at Thresh 9, where 300,000 people were not afraid today who had been afraid 6 days ago. And I thought, we are just getting started. The signal did not look like anything at first. Kess found it on a routine deep-range sweep, one of the passive sensor arrays the Varric had built into the hull that had no equivalent in any human or Council technology. Sensors that could reach beyond the outer boundary of charted space and read the electromagnetic texture of what lay beyond. We had been running them continuously since launch, more out of habit than expectation, the way you run background processes on a system, because disabling them feels like a gamble you have not earned the right to take. She found it on a Tuesday, by the ship's calendar, which had been set to Earth Standard Time, because Dara had insisted and I had agreed, and she brought it to me quietly, at the beginning of the morning cycle. before anyone else was awake. She said, "Owen, I need to show you something." The display she assembled was not dramatic. No flashing alerts, no alarm tone, just a soft rendering in the blue light of the passive readout, a pattern of signals, repeating at irregular intervals, originating from beyond the outer rift. The rift was the boundary of charted space in the galactic eastward direction, a region of dense stellar debris and gravitational anomalies that made navigation difficult enough that no species had yet built permanent infrastructure past it. There were survey records of the space beyond it, old ones, and some more recent drone data, but nothing that suggested significant activity. The pattern Kess showed me was not natural. It had structure, repetition with variation, the signature of transmission, of encoded information, not the chaotic rhythm of stellar events. Something was broadcasting from beyond the rift. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "The signature has been present in archived deep-range data from the Varix records for 11,000 years, she said. However, the signal was dormant, background level, for most of that period. In the last 14 months, it has increased in intensity by a factor of approximately 800. I looked at the readout. That is a significant increase. Yes. What is it saying? I cannot decode the content, she said, but I can tell you about the behavior pattern associated with the source, based on cross-referencing the signal with the passive gravitational and optical data from the same region. Tell me. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. Kess did not hesitate. Organizing. 6 star systems in the outer rift region, she said, each with previously documented planetary bodies, are no longer showing those planetary bodies in their current optical data. The planets are gone. I looked at her. Or rather, I looked at the core structure in the way that I had come to look at it when I was speaking to her directly, the way you look at a person's face rather than their hands, even when their hands are doing the talking. How gone? I said. Completely, she said. Not destroyed in the conventional sense. There is no debris field consistent with collision or detonation. The mass is simply absent, as if it was removed. The room was very quiet. How long did each removal take? I said. Based on the last optical survey data for each system, versus current readings, between 3 and 11 days per system. And the systems were inhabited. 3 of the 6 were documented as uninhabited, she said. The other 3 had small populations, survey stations, resource extraction teams, long-range observer posts, belonging to various species. None of the populations have made contact since the last optical survey. I sat down. I did not plan to sit down. My legs made the decision. I said, how long, until whatever this is, reaches inhabited space at its current rate of progress? Assuming consistent rate of expansion, and based on the distance between the outer rift systems and the nearest permanent colonies, she said, approximately 22 months. I thought about Thresh 9, about the privateer fleet that had left without a shot because of the math. I thought about the Council and their ultimatum, and the 11 species whose combined military power had been enough to threaten the reclassification of humanity. I thought about what 22 months meant. I said, how complete is your analysis? 96.3% confidence in the signal source origin, 89% confidence in the behavior pattern classification. The 6 missing planetary systems are confirmed beyond any analytical doubt. What's in the remaining 10% of uncertainty? The possibility that I am misinterpreting the data, she said, which I am including for accuracy, rather than because I believe it is likely. What do your Varric databases say about this? A pause longer than her usual. The Varric had records of something they called the silence. It is referenced in 17 separate historical texts and in 12 strategic documents, always obliquely, always in the context of something the Varric feared encountering and hoped they never would. The texts describe it in terms that I can only translate approximately. A force that reduces, that erases, that moves through settled space without communication and without engagement, leaving nothing behind. The Varric considered it the only threat for which the margin had been designed, and which they were grateful had not appeared during their own time. They built this ship to fight something they hoped they would never need to fight. Yes, she said, that appears to be correct. I stayed in the navigation room for a long time after that. The The stars outside the view screen looked the same as they always did. But I could not see the rift from here. It was on the far side of the galaxy's chart from our current position. But I knew it was there, and I knew that 11,000 years ago, a species of cold-blooded beings had built a ship to answer something that had now arrived. They had not survived to use it. We had found it. I went to wake Dara. She came awake fast. She always did, the way people who have spent time in dangerous places learn to, and she sat up and looked at my face and said, without me saying anything, "How bad?" I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "We cannot fight this alone." "No," I said. "We need the council." "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "The same council that threatened to reclassify human space 2 months ago." "The same one," she thought. I watched her think. She was very good at it, fast and structured, her mind moving through possibilities, the way her hands moved through technical problems, with confidence and without wasted motion. Then she said, "They will listen if they believe us." "They will believe us if they see the data," I said. "Do we have enough data?" "Kess does," I said. 11,000 years of it. It took 4 days to reach the nearest council relay station, and we spent those 4 days in continuous work. Kess compiled the full evidentiary package, the deep-range signal data, the optical comparison data showing the missing planetary systems, the behavioral pattern analysis, the Varick historical references to the silence, everything translated into standard galactic common, with dual-format supplementary materials for each major species scientific review process. She worked without sleep, which she did not need, and she worked without complaint, and by the end of it, she had built something that was not a request or a warning, but a complete scientific case, documented to the standard that the most rigorous review bodies in the known galaxy would accept. I read every page of it. When I finished, I sent it to the Council Secretariat with a cover document that said, in its entirety, the attached represents the complete deep-range analysis from the vessel margin regarding a pattern of anomalous events in the outer rift region. We assess this situation as an immediate and civilization-level concern. We are available for direct briefing at the Council's earliest convenience. We recommend treating this information as a priority. The time available is not unlimited. I signed it with my name. Just my name. Owen Carr. Not captain. Not commander. Not any rank I did not have. Any authority I had not been given. Just Owen Carr, salvage engineer, registered independent operator, and apparently the only person in the known galaxy flying an 11,000-year-old warship. The Council convened an emergency session in 71 hours. A record, by the measure of any historical emergency session I could find in the public record. Usually they took weeks. The message they sent was brief. The Council requests the presence of Margin's captain and the ship's data archive officer at the joint chamber at the earliest feasible date. Data archive officer. That was Kess, which was a designation she had never held and which I found, on reflection, deeply appropriate. The session was held at the Central Council Station, a structure larger than most small moons, orbiting a shared star at the symbolic center of the charted galaxy, a place where no species had territorial claim because no species had built it alone. Every major power had contributed to it over a period of 600 years, and it looked like it, angles and aesthetics from a dozen different design traditions, all somehow cohering into something that felt purposeful rather than accidental. We parked the Margin at a distance that the station's traffic authority found acceptable, and that the station's structural engineers, Kess had been monitoring their communications, found profoundly relieving. I went in alone. Well, not alone. Dara came. Kess came in a form she had developed over the preceding weeks. A speaker unit we had fitted to a mobile cart, compact and undramatic, because Kess had decided that being dramatic about her physical form was a waste of attention that could be spent on the actual conversation. The chamber was enormous. Every species had their own section, their own delegation style, their own way of occupying space. I had been to the council chambers once before, years earlier, on a trade dispute filing that had been part of a salvage contract, and the experience had been overwhelming enough that I had filed my papers and left as quickly as possible. This was different. The Vithani delegation was already seated when we entered. They were old, older as a species than almost anyone in the room, and they showed it in the way that species show age, when age has made them more rather than less. Their lead delegate was a being I will describe only as still, in the way that things are still when they have seen enough movement to appreciate it. She spoke first, which was a significant break from standard council procedure. No preamble, no formal address. Just, show us what you have found. Kess presented. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, she presented. The signal data, the missing systems, the behavioral pattern, the Varric records, the estimated timeline, the nature of what they were calling the silence. The chamber was very quiet for a very long time when she finished. Then the Grethian admiral, who was, I had not known until that moment, also a council delegate, leaned forward and said, "How confident are you in the 22-month estimate?" 89%, Kess said. "What is in the remaining 11%? The possibility that the rate is accelerating," she said, "in which case the timeline would be shorter." The chamber was quiet again. I looked around the room. 11 species, the combined intelligence, the combined resources, the combined history of civilizations that had been navigating the stars for thousands of years before humanity had learned to look up. They were afraid. Not the individual afraid of someone standing over you, but the civilizational afraid of something you cannot immediately contextualize, something that does not fit the categories you have built for understanding the universe. It was the most human thing I had ever seen aliens do. And then the Vithani delegate did something that the briefing notes I had been given said Vithani delegates never did. She turned in her seat, looked directly at me and said, "Will you help us?" I thought about what helping them would mean. The margin, against something that had been removing planets from star systems. The ship the Varric had built to answer something they had hoped they would never need to answer. And me, Owen Carr, salvage engineer, the person who had put a hand on a console on a dead planet because he had nothing better to do, and his father's voice was in his head, telling him that skills were answers. I let her wait, not to be dramatic, not to negotiate, but because the question deserved the weight of a real pause, rather than a quick answer. Then I said, "Yes." I said, "Not for the council. For the people in those systems." She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded once. I said, "Yes." We found the silence at the edge of the outer rift, and it was not what any of us had imagined. It was not a ship, it was not a fleet, it was not even a being in the way that the word being implies something contained, something with a boundary between itself and everything else. It was a field, enormous, slow-moving, and total. A region of space approximately 40 million kilometers across, in which every piece of matter it encountered underwent the same process: reduction, simplification. Whatever was in its path was taken apart at a level so fundamental that what remained was indistinguishable from the background state of empty space. Not destroyed, not converted, reduced to a condition that was technically the same as nothing. The Varric had understood this. Their records, the ones Kess had translated, were more accurate than I had hoped, and more terrifying for being so. We held a briefing in the navigation room 2 days before the intercept. Myself, Dara, the crew, and through the comms channel, the Council's Joint Tactical Committee, who were coordinating the fleet that had been assembled in the 2 months since the emergency session. 312 vessels from 11 species, positioned in a broad formation at the rift's edge, the largest unified fleet in the history of the Council. It looked large until you put it next to the operational area of the silence. I did not say this out loud, because it was not useful information. What Kess had spent the preceding weeks calculating was not a strategy to destroy the silence, which was not, based on the Varric records, something that could be destroyed in any conventional sense, but a strategy to interrupt it. The Varric had understood this too, which was part of why they had built what they had built. The ship was not a weapon of annihilation, it was a weapon of disruption, capable of generating a field effect that interfered with the specific process the silence used to reduce matter, not permanently, not everywhere, but in a targeted area, for a targeted duration, like a fire that you cannot put out but can contain. You could build a barrier. The barrier would hold for a limited time. How limited depended on variables Kess could not fully predict, because the Varric had not completed enough testing before their civilization ended. But it would hold long enough for the silence to be redirected. Not stopped, not killed, but moved. Into the gravitational sink of the rift itself, where the debris field and anomalies would absorb its progress for what Kess estimated as several thousand years. Not a permanent solution, a temporary one, long enough for the galaxy to find the permanent one, whatever that turned out to be. I explained this to the Council's tactical committee, who spent 40 minutes asking questions, and then said they would proceed under my tactical guidance for the engagement, which was a sentence I had not expected to hear in my lifetime, and which I wrote down verbatim in my personal log, so I would not forget it. We launched on a Thursday, Earth Standard Time, which I was grateful for because it gave the event a human timestamp in the record. The fleet held position. The margin went first. I want to say that I was calm. I was not calm. I was the same afraid I had always been, the working kind of afraid, the kind that makes your hands very steady and your attention very focused, not because fear has been overcome, but because it has been put somewhere useful. Dara was at tactical. Leo was at the secondary sensor array, those careful eyes scanning outputs with a precision that reminded me of his first day aboard, when he had looked at the hull with the expression, not of wonder, but of assessment. Liam was in the structural monitoring station, because if something hit us, he needed to know about it before the hull did. Cora was managing the power distribution, because what we were about to do would draw more power than we had drawn since the reactor came fully online. And power distribution under extreme load was not something you trusted to automation. Pete was in the propulsion bay because Pete in the propulsion bay was the difference between running and not running. Nora was recording. Every instrument reading, every decision, every second. She said, "This should be in the record." I said she was right. The silence appeared on the passive display as we crossed the rift boundary. Not dramatic, not sudden, just an increasing presence in the readouts, a region where the background data grew heavy and strange, like static in a signal growing louder the closer you got to the source. I had expected something visible, some visual manifestation. There was none. Space looked the same, stars looked the same, but the instruments were reading something that made my technical training say, "This is not normal, and what is not normal here is very large." Kess guided us to the engagement position with the calm she always had, the voice that had started as tones and sensations on a dead planet and had built itself into something I trusted completely. She said, "Field generation ready." I said, "Activate." What happened next I have described to many people over the years, and I have never found words that fully carry it. The margin does not make dramatic sounds when it operates. The Varric did not build drama into their engineering. They built efficiency. What happened was quiet in the way that very large things are quiet. A shift in the power readings. A change in the texture of the hull vibration, from the steady hum of transit drive to something slower and deeper, like the first note of an instrument so large that you feel it in your chest, rather than hearing it in the air. And the field extended. On the display I could see it, not visually, but in the data, in the instruments. The margins generated fields spreading outward in the direction of the silence, in a shape that Kess had calculated and that the Varric had designed. A barrier of specific interference, targeted at the exact process by which the silence reduced matter. For 40 seconds nothing happened, and then the silence changed direction. Not quickly, not dramatically. It was a shift that took several minutes to become clear in the data, a gradual alteration of the field's expansion vector, the way water moves around an obstacle it cannot pass through. And the direction it shifted toward was the rift itself, the debris field, the gravitational anomalies, the complex and resistant terrain of the boundary space that would absorb and redirect and slow something that could otherwise move through open space, without anything to push back against. I watched the data for a long time. Then Kess said, "The redirection is holding." "How long?" I said. "The field will need to remain active for approximately 19 hours to ensure the silence has committed fully to the rift trajectory," she said. "After that, its own momentum will carry it in, and then the rift does the rest," she said. "Over a period of centuries." I said, 19 hours. Can we maintain field output for 19 hours? "I can," she said. "But I want you to know the cost before you commit to it." "Tell me." "The field generation will require approximately 60% of current reactor output," she said. "For 19 hours. The reactor will survive. but systems currently using that power will go offline. Life support, navigation, propulsion. This ship will be stationary and dark for 19 hours. I looked at Dara. She had already run the same math. I could see it in her face. What's the risk level? I said. Unknown, Kess said. The risk is whatever comes for a stationary ship with no propulsion and minimal life support over a 19-hour period in the outer rift. Coffee stations? Liam called from his station, with a seriousness that was only partially a joke. Offline, Kess said. I am sorry. There was a brief silence. Pete said, do it. Cora said, do it. Nora, without looking up from her recording instruments, obviously do it. Leo said nothing. He just nodded once. Liam said, for the record, I am doing this with a clear conscience and no caffeine, and I would like that noted. I looked at Dara. She said, Owen. I said, I know. She said, do it. I said, Kess, maintain field output. Redirect non-essential power. Keep us in the dark as long as you need to. She said, understood. The lights went out. Not completely. Emergency lighting, amber-toned and low, kept the stations visible, kept faces readable across the room. But the hum of the ship changed again, going lower, going deeper, going to that fundamental note that the Varric had built at the heart of everything they made. And outside the view screen the stars were the same, and the silence was moving, slowly and inevitably, in the direction it needed to go. We sat in the amber light for 19 hours. We talked. Not about the mission, not about the situation, about other things. Dara told a story about a cargo contract that had gone spectacularly wrong 3 years before she came to find me, involving a falsified manifest and 2 very confused customs officials and a species of amphibians who had been extremely calm about the whole situation. Pete told us about his garden, the one he had been growing in his station quarters for 6 years, the one he was going to expand when he got back. Nora read from a paper notebook, actual written words, things she had been composing privately, and she did not explain them, just read them, and they were good. Leo told me, for the first time, about where he had grown up. A deep space mining station, 20 families, no gravity most of the time. He had learned to navigate corridors by touch in the dark, because the power cut out regularly. He had learned to assess structural integrity by sound, because there were no instruments to spare. He had learned to be useful before he knew the word for it. I said, that is why you are good at this. He said, that is why you recognized me. I thought about that for a while. Kess spoke every hour with a status update. Calm, clear. The silence was moving. The trajectory was holding. The field was stable. Reactor output consistent. 17 hours. 15. 12. 8. At the 4-hour mark, Dara fell asleep in her chair. I did not wake her. At the 2-hour mark, Cora said, power readings are holding beautifully. Whatever the Varric built in this reactor, it was built to last. At the 30-minute mark, Kess said, the silence has committed to the rift trajectory. Redirection is confirmed beyond the ability of the field to alter. I said, can we bring systems back online? Yes, she said. Bring them up, I said. The hum changed again. The lights came back. Not the full warmth they usually had. They came up in stages, brightening over the span of several minutes as the power returned to the secondary systems, and then the primary ones. The propulsion readouts woke. The navigation display lit. The coffee station on Deck 7, Leo checked immediately, came back online within 2 minutes of the main systems restoring. Liam made a sound of profound personal relief. Outside, in the rift, the silence moved where it needed to move. The fleet, which had been holding position 20,000 kilometers back through all 19 hours, I had maintained a low-power comm channel to the fleet commander, a Vithani senior officer, throughout the engagement, sent a single message when the final field status came through. It said, confirmed, the outer rift is registering full silence entry. What is your vessel status? I said, all systems nominal, minor power reserves to rebuild, no casualties. There was a pause on the channel. Then the Vithani officer said something that my translator rendered as a formal acknowledgement in the highest register of their diplomatic language. A register that, Kess quietly told me, was typically reserved for communications between heads of state. I said thank you, which is what you say when you do not have the right words for something and you want the sentiment to be clear anyway. The voyage back to the council station took 11 days, and they were the quietest 11 days I had spent in a long time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was taking time to settle into the shape it would eventually have. Experience needs time to become memory. Memory needs time to become meaning. I spent those days in the data core room each evening, talking to Kess. On the 9th day I said, "Tell me the third name." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In the Varix language, the sound does not translate directly. The closest equivalent in any language I have access to would be something like, the thing we built when we understood we had already failed, and the thing we hoped would make that failure mean something." I sat with that. "That is a long name," I said. "Yes," she said. "Does it fit?" She was quiet for a long time, longer than usual, and then she said, "It did. I think now it is perhaps not complete. What would you add?" "Something about what you made of it," she said. "What you changed it into, what you made it mean." I looked at the branching structure of the data core, at the slow pulse of blue-white light at its center. Outside, in the space beyond the hull, the galaxy was the same as it had always been. Old, complex, vast in ways that made human ambition seem small. I had stopped finding that terrifying. The Council awarded humanity a full voting seat at the Joint Chamber, 4 days after we returned to the station. The vote was not unanimous. 3 delegations abstained, but it passed, and it was announced in a formal session attended by every member species. And when Ambassador Flynn received the notification, she sent me a message that said, "Owen, I would like to shake your hand." I sent back, "I am in the area." We met at a small reception hall in the residential sector of the station, and she did shake my hand, and then she said, "I still have no idea what that ship is." And I said, "Yes, you do. You just haven't decided what category to put it in yet." She said, "What category would you suggest?" I said, "Ours." The Margin came to orbit Earth on a Thursday, Earth Standard Time. The crew stood at the view screen when the planet came into view. All of us, including Kess, who experienced it through the external sensors, and who said, in a voice that carried something I had learned to recognize as feeling, even though she had no name for it, "It is very blue." "Yes," I said. "The Varix records do not include a planet of this color," she said. "There are a lot of things in the Varix records that we're going to add to," I said. She said, "I know." The ship is registered, now, to no nation and no fleet. The registration document, which I filed myself with the Council's commercial registry, lists the owner as Margin Crew, Collective. It lists the captain as Owen Carr, Independent Operator. It lists the ship's class as Unique Designation Varic Warship, converted for general purpose. The Council registrar spent 20 minutes trying to find the right form for that, and eventually used 4 different forms stapled together, which I thought was an admirably human solution for an alien bureaucrat. A journalist asked me, at the Council press session, what gave me the right to claim an alien warship and change the balance of galactic power. She was not hostile about it, just direct, the way good questions are direct. I thought about the dead planet, the canyon, the breach in the hull, the console that had warmed under my hand, and the ship that had exhaled. I thought about the Varic, who had built something extraordinary out of their own failure and hidden it away out of fear. I thought about my father and the drone in the storage bay and what he had told me about skills and questions. I said, nothing gave me the right. The ship needed someone willing to try. I was there. I was willing. And I had the tools. That is usually how things happen, in my experience. Not because of rights, because of proximity and stubbornness. The journalist wrote that down. Later, Dara told me it was the best answer I had ever given to anything. I said, you always say that about the ones you didn't get to review first. She said, because those are always the best ones. Kess, who had been listening through the ship's comm system. For the record, I agree. Leo was standing at the view screen when I found him, looking at Earth below. I stood next to him. He said, what happens now? I said, we fix what needs fixing. We go where things have gone wrong. We don't start fights, but we finish them. He said, "That's not a plan." I said, "No, it's a practice. Plans run out. Practices don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good." We stood there for a while, looking at Earth, while behind us the margin held its orbit as it had held everything else. Steadily, patiently, built for permanence by people who ran out of time to see what they made, and inherited by people who were going to make sure it counted. The ship did not exhale again. It did not need to. It was already home.